The house opened out at the bottom into the dining room, the one with the big rectangular table that almost touched the wall on one side. Two tall windows faced forward toward the porch. As I came into the room, the airy silence between thunder felt heavier somehow. The glass was streaked with water, framing the darkness outside like a fogged photograph. I leaned slightly, trying to catch a better view past the reflection. A flash lit up the sky so fast it made me blink. In that split second, the smear of darkness solidified into a woman. She stood right at the porch railing, her back straight, hands at her sides, not moving at all. The rain was pouring over the brim of the porch roof and splashing near her shoes, pooling around them. Her shadow ran up the siding like a burnt mark. Stillness like that, it's harder to ignore than movement. I'd read somewhere that some intruders, especially in rural areas, just stand completely still to draw a person's curiosity. The mind registers something's there but can't put it into a category fast enough, so you keep looking, waiting for it to resolve into a neighbor or delivery person. That pause is what they count on. I used to love summer storms. The way the thunder rolled over the house made me feel strangely calm. Until that night, I was lying in the guest bed at my grandmother's place, window cracked for the breeze when I heard it. A voice, faint, almost drowned out by the rain. Hello. Drawn out like they wanted me to respond. Every time the thunder hit, she was closer to the door. I didn't see her at first, just a distortion through glass and rain, like the shape of a person halfway erased by the storm. It was one of those moments where your eyes keep sliding across the same spot without really processing what's there. The porch light was off. The rain slid down the glass in clear sheets, blurring everything. All I caught was a faint shadow moving with the wind, not in it. Upstairs, the guest room was quiet except for the storm. My grandmother kept it neat. White curtains, a thin quilt, the smell of laundry soap still clinging to the pillow. I'd been sitting on the bed, listening to distant rumbles roll past. Then came the sound, a shift, maybe a knock, but not hard enough to be certain, just enough to feel like I should check. I stood up, the floorboards under my bare feet cold. The old stairs creaked if you weren't careful, and I tried to step on the edges like she'd taught me when I was a kid. Another burst of light showed her face, or at least the pale oval of it. Then thunder came down, rolling over the hills and beating against the windows. I stood frozen, unsure if she'd seen me yet. When the sound started to fade, that's when she spoke. Hello. The word was steady, almost too level for someone caught in the rain. No cough, no tremor, just waiting for the thunder to end so she could be heard. Once I noticed it, the timing felt deliberate, like she'd been waiting for just the right pocket of silence. It didn't make sense. People came to the porch sometimes, mail carriers, the occasional neighbor, but not in the middle of a storm, not just to stand there. I stepped back a little from the glass, thinking maybe she might just walk away if I didn't react. But the windows worked against me here. From the porch, even with no lights on inside, the living room and dining room felt like giant aquariums. The dark behind me wasn't a shield. It was a backdrop she could see through perfectly if she adjusted her angle. I thought about waving, even saying something, but the instinct to pull farther inside was stronger. My grandmother's voice in my head. If someone's here for you, they'll let you know. If they don't, you don't own the first word. My hand brushed the frame of the dining room doorway as I backed into it, the paint cool and worn smooth over the years. Her figure didn't change. She didn't step forward. She didn't reach for the door. Still as if she were a cutout place there, rainwater kidding itself by thinking it could soak through her clothes. There was no umbrella dripping nearby, no bag in her hands, no twitch of impatience from someone waiting for help. I took another step back, and the table blocked my view. I told myself maybe she was lost, maybe she needed directions, but that didn't explain why she'd chosen to speak in that slim pause between thunder cracks. It sat in my head all wrong, I'd heard people call out in storms before. Voices get broken up, shouted over the rain. They don't come out smooth. They don't feel timed. Halfway up the stairs, I realized she could see me if she turned her head just slightly toward the side window. The weight of that possible eye contact pressed between my shoulder blades. Every creak of the old wood seemed to echo down. From the top step, I could still smell that wet, cold earth smell the storm had blown inside when I'd cracked the upstairs window earlier. In the guest room again, I closed the window, pulled the curtain across, and stood there listening. The thunder was quicker now, the seconds between flash and sound shorter, and under it came that muffled repeat of her greeting, just quieter, like I was hearing the memory instead of the actual voice, but it was enough to keep me rooted to the spot. I thought about how darkness works in that house. The porch has just enough overhang to keep the very front dry, but the angle of the rain that night sent mist toward the door. The window glass always carried a bit of reflection in storms, making the outside world harder to read. But from outside looking in, with lightning to help, you'd see everything with surprising clarity. It was one of those layouts that felt safe until you realized how much of your life it displayed to anyone willing to stand still long enough to watch. I sat back down on the bed, telling myself she'd be gone when the next flash came. Tried counting seconds between lightning and thunder to measure the storm's distance like my grandfather used to do, but my timing kept breaking because I'd glanced toward the staircase, half expecting to see movement at the bottom. There was nothing, just the low hum of the fridge 2 rooms away, and the faint whistle of wind around the gutters. The thing that unnerved me most wasn't her being there, it was not knowing if she was still there after I'd left the window. That kind of stillness sticks to you. It makes every small household noise sound like something adjusting itself downstairs. When I finally did check the rain-slick view again, leaning over just enough, it looked empty. But the thought came fast. If she'd stepped away from the porch, I wouldn't hear it over the storm until she was already somewhere else around the house. The echoes of her voice, dry and paced, stayed with me on each creak back toward the bed. I didn't close my eyes right away. The angle of the spare room's door left a bare sliver view of the hallway, angled toward the stairwell. That's exactly where I kept looking, half ready to hear that same deliberate hello again, stitched into the next break in the thunder. You never think about how many ways there are until you're counting them in the dark. I sat for maybe 3 minutes in that guest room, every creak of the house feeling like a step somewhere it shouldn't be, before I got up again. The layout of my grandmother's house had never been something I treated like a map, but once you've had the idea that someone might be close, you start tracing every doorway in your head. The guest bedroom is right above the dining room, with that big pair of windows looking out over the front porch. From the bed you can see the roof overhang below, and beyond that the driveway if you lean far enough. Off the side of the room is a short hall that splits. One side goes to the other upstairs bedroom, the one my grandma uses for sewing now. The other side drops into the staircase that lands between the dining room and the living room. Downstairs, the main stretch of the house is basically a line from front to back. Dining room to kitchen, kitchen to laundry nook to the back door. It's not a big house, but it's all long sight lines and old wood that carry sound in strange ways. From the top of the stairs, you can see straight to the side windows in the dining room. Those face the street, and even with the storm they always feel a little too open. I kept the lights off and moved slow, partly so I wouldn't silhouette myself if she was still out there. My bare feet caught the cooler patches of tile when I stepped into the kitchen. That side door is narrow, with a tall pane of glass covered only by a thin lace curtain. People walking by can glance in without trying. I held the curtain aside just enough to see the slick glisten of the walkway, the shine of rain pooling near the garden bed. Nothing moved, but that didn't make it feel empty. The rain was steady enough now to make a soft but constant rush. It covered almost every subtle sound, the fridge hum, the subtle groan of the roof beams. The only thing above it was the occasional crack of thunder, which made the windows flex in their frames. That's the part that unnerved me. How easily someone could move around the sides of the house without me catching more than a shadow. I remembered reading once that burglars often look for homes where noise can mask their approach. Rain, lawnmowers, rush hour traffic, it's all cover. I started with the kitchen door. The deadbolt was turned fully, the little metal tab firm when I pushed. The lock on the knob was set too. I still jiggled the handle, out of reflex. That dull click felt too loud, like it announced to the whole street that I was right there, keeping tabs. I moved on through the narrow hall toward the laundry nook. The floor here dropped just slightly, so your step shifted, and the back door came into view. Another window in it, slightly bigger than the one on the side door. This one pebbled glass to distort the view. I leaned close enough to catch vague shapes. Tree limb, fence post, nothing else. Lock was fine, chain was on. Essity. Heading back toward the dining room meant passing through the living room. That space has 2 long windows facing the porch, each one almost as tall as the door and only about 8 feet away from it. If she was still there, those would give her a perfect line into the main part of the house. I skirted the very edge of the room, keeping to the side with the bookcase, and checked the front door lock without looking straight out. The bolt was stubborn, didn't wiggle, but I noticed the light from outside didn't change when I got near. That meant the porch light really was off. My grandmother had once mentioned it worked on and off. Some days it would turn on fine, others it wouldn't respond to the switch at all. She'd shrugged it off that time, saying she didn't go out at night much anyway. With each lock I checked, the layout of the house felt clearer in my head. The big street-facing windows downstairs, the smaller square windows upstairs that overlooked the driveway. From the sewing room, you could see the side yard and almost to the neighbor's fence. From my guest room, it was all front view. If someone wanted to stay hidden but see inside, they'd just stand in the corridor between the side of the porch and the driveway's slope. The shadows there are deep year-round, made deeper that night by the way the rain thinned the street's light into streaks. Upstairs again, I moved through the sewing room to the small closet window. This one had a single latch, and I pressed it down, making sure. The glass was fogged slightly from the temperature difference, and outside the driveway shone under the wet glare of a street lamp. No people. I watched for a few seconds longer than I needed to before drawing back. I kept thinking about how people choose targets. Not just random doors to rattle, but watching first. I'd heard before that someone checking a property doesn't have to break anything right away. They'll note when lights turn on, how long it takes after knocking for anyone to appear. Even whether you pull curtains or ignore the outside. A single night can be a test for another one later. Counting the doors wasn't just paranoia. It was figuring out all the ways someone could step inside if they wanted to. The final check was the sliding glass door in the dining room. Grandma never kept the curtain drawn all the way here, just enough to block part of the view. The handle was secure, the latch lined up right. Still, in the reflection, my own shadow moved against the backdrop of rain-streaked darkness, and for a split second it felt like maybe there was another figure deeper in the glass. I slid the curtain completely shut. Every lock was fine, every door and window was as it should be. And still, standing there in the middle of the dining room with the rain thickening outside, I had that prickled feeling on the back of my neck. It's the same feeling you get in a crowd when you're sure someone is watching, even if you don't see them. Maybe it was the porch. Maybe it was knowing that if she'd stepped away, she could still be circling. As I started back toward the stairs, I thought about a story my grandmother once told me, one I hadn't really thought about until then. It had seemed ordinary at the time, something she mentioned while we sorted groceries. She'd been out one afternoon and noticed a young woman watching her from the end of an aisle at the store. No reason, no words, just holding a mild smile like it was part of some polite exchange that never actually happened. She'd told it almost like a curiosity, not as something unsettling. But walking through the silent rooms that night, after hearing that voice on the porch, the memory landed harder. It wasn't the woman herself in the memory that stood out now. It was the stillness. That same quality of waiting without stepping forward. The thought that maybe someone can carry the same presence from one place to another, the way an expression or stance repeats. The pattern was loose, but it was there. Enough that I climbed the stairs slower, replaying her words about it in my head. The storm was still heavy when I stepped into the guest room again, the walls carrying the low drum of water hitting the porch roof. I closed the door most of the way, leaving only a narrow gap, and sat on the bed. My grandmother's grocery store story didn't feel random anymore. Not after the locks, the layout, and the dark that seemed to press against the windows like a thing with weight. It's easy to shrug off something odd when you're not alone on a dark porch. When there's someone beside you, it's just a story to tell. But the next morning, with the storm drained down to a slow drip off the gutters, my grandmother made tea and told me what she'd seen a few weeks before. We sat at the small, round kitchen table, the one that clicks softly when you set a cup down because one leg is a little shorter. Steam curled out of her mug, and the light from the back window was flat and gray from the leftover clouds. She said she'd gone to the grocery store in the next town over. Nothing special, just picking up flour and eggs. While she was checking the baking aisle, she noticed a woman standing at the far end. A little younger, early 30s maybe. She wasn't pretending to browse like most people do when they pace an aisle. She was just standing there, holding the handle of her cart, watching. No talking. No movement except the slow rise and fall of her shoulders as she breathed. Grandma said the lights in that store always made everything look a little too sharp. Colors washed out under buzzing fluorescent tubes. The sound of those lights sits low behind your ears, if you listen for it. Every aisle has its own background noise too. In the baking section, it's the squeal of shopping cart wheels that need oil. Sometimes the clatter of a jar getting reshelved too hard in the condiment aisle nearby. But over all of that, Grandma noticed the silence from the woman. Even when other shoppers passed between them, the woman's eyes didn't move off her. Grandma isn't much for drama. If something bothers her, she usually brushes right past it. She grabbed a bag of sugar and tried not to look back. But aisles curve into each other in that store, and a few minutes later when she turned into the canned goods section, the same woman was there again. Not close, just far enough away that it couldn't be called following exactly. Her cart was empty. She kept that faint, polite-looking smile on her face. It wasn't warm or excited. It was the kind of smile a stranger might give at a crosswalk, just enough to show they've seen you, but not enough to invite talking. I asked if the woman ever said anything. Grandma shook her head. She said there were other people around the whole time, 2 or 3 in every aisle. Nothing about it said danger in a way you could point to. She'd even forgotten about it by the time she paid and drove home. Sitting there now, stirring her tea with the slow click of the spoon against ceramic, she said the woman had felt familiar somehow, like she'd seen her before but couldn't place from where. The more she talked about it, the more the small details built up in my head. The deliberate way someone can hold distance in public spaces, but still keep choosing spots in your eye line. How easy it would be to make note of what brand you grab, how long you linger between choices, what card you pull out at the register. When you're in the middle of it, you think of it as harmless or coincidental. Random errands pass like that all the time. But with the image of the woman standing on the porch the night before, motionless, speaking only when she knew she'd be heard, it didn't feel random now. I pictured the sharpness of fluorescent light swapped out for the uneven flash of lightning, the steady hum of ceiling fixtures turned into the deep, rolling stretch of thunder, the empty metal cartwheels replaced with the glisten of wet boards under flat-soled shoes, that faint, fixed half-smile surviving in both settings, the way stillness travels if the person carrying it knows how. It made me think about awareness in public spaces, how easy it is to miss someone who's watching you if they don't break your personal bubble. They can make their presence known with something as small as holding your gaze a few beats longer than normal, or waiting where they know you'll see them again without having to catch up. If that same person wanted to find you somewhere else later, outside a busy grocery store, they'd already know a lot more about you than you'd guess just from a glance. Grandma said she'd finally turned her cart toward the frozen section, and when she looked back down the long aisle, the woman was gone. She didn't see her at the registers, didn't pass her in the parking lot. It had been an easy thing to ignore because nothing obvious happened. But as I listened that morning, watching the way her hand rested on the rim of her mug while she spoke, I could line it up in my mind with how the porch felt in the storm. Quiet, expectant, not pushing forward, but present all the same. I didn't say much about what I'd seen the night before. I still wasn't sure if they were the same person. The memory of the rain, the way it stuck her in place like she belonged to the weather, wasn't something I could match cleanly to a fluorescent-lit grocery store. But the familiarity Grandma mentioned made my own thoughts lean in that direction. The idea that she might have been near my grandmother before, that maybe she'd watched long enough to learn more than either of us had realized. I caught myself looking at details differently while we sat there. The time on the stove clock clicking over from 8:09 to 8:10, the sound of tires pushing through leftover rainwater on the street outside. Whether the curtains in the front room were still pulled close, each small thing felt like part of an invisible thread between incidents. Even patterns you can't prove start to take shape if you spend enough time turning them over in your mind. By the time we cleared the cups and rinsed them in the sink, the gray light outside had lifted a little. Grandma went to fold laundry, and I stood by the counter for a minute longer than I had to, pressing my teeth against the inside of my cheek. It's one thing to think a stranger is odd in the controlled space of an aisle. It's another to think they might choose a setting like a porch in the middle of a storm to stand just close enough. One carries the safety of other people as cover. The other strips that away. The rest of the day, I kept thinking about how someone makes the move from one environment to the next. If the rainy night was deliberate, and the store sighting wasn't coincidence, then at some point, there's a moment where interest turns into approach. And not in a way that's loud or fast, more like casually stepping into the same frame twice, in two completely different places. At the time, I didn't connect that line of thought to what would happen next. I didn't imagine someone else, different setting, different method, would try something similar, starting from a public space and steering toward isolation. But that's where things went. Only instead of a store aisle or a suburban porch, it would start through a screen. The kind of meeting you choose for yourself, thinking you're controlling the variable, until the shape of it changes and you realize you're back in the same position, someone else holding the advantage of stillness, waiting for you to make the next move. Meeting someone new isn't supposed to make you watch every shadow on the sidewalk. That summer, I was in Syracuse finishing up a short-term program. It was the kind of stretch where the afternoons felt heavy and slow, and every metal railing you touched was warm from sitting in the sun all day. I had been talking to a girl named Stephanie on Hinge for a couple of weeks. She seemed normal enough. Photos with her dog, messages about the courses she was taking, a little bit of back and forth about meet-up spots in the city. We'd set a time to meet in person one weekend afternoon, somewhere public, somewhere that felt low effort. I got to the meeting spot early. It was one of those wide sidewalks downtown, where the storefronts had big glass fronts and brick trim, and the edge of the walk dropped to the street under a thin line of parking meters. Even in the late afternoon, the light was still sharp and unfiltered. I could feel it pushing against the back of my neck. Heat radiated up from the pavement, carrying that faint, sticky smell of warmed tar. There were people out, small groups, a few couples, the hum of traffic 2 blocks over. I checked the time and texted her that I was there. That's when I noticed the older man walking toward me from the end of the block. He had a crisp polo shirt tucked into belted shorts, sunglasses that hid most of his face, and an easy smile. He stopped a few feet away and said he was Stephanie's father. His voice was calm, and the first thing he said after that was that Stephanie had run a little late, but told him to come pick me up in the car so we wouldn't have to wait in the sun. It caught me off guard. I was expecting to see Stephanie herself, maybe walking up from the same direction, not a stranger delivering her messages in person. I asked where she was exactly, trying to buy a little time. He gestured toward the end of the street and said she'd be waiting in the car, and we could drive somewhere cooler to talk. His tone had that casual, confident tilt people use when they already expect you to agree. I told him I'd be fine waiting right there. I even laughed a little like it wasn't a big deal. But the smile on his face didn't change, and he didn't step back. He started talking again, saying the car was just around the corner, that it would make more sense to wait there in the air conditioning. That same ease in his voice, like all of this was perfectly normal. It's not unusual for someone to use an everyday role to make themselves seem familiar or safe. Parent, teacher, family friend. It takes something sharp and suspicious and wraps it in the kind of situation you'd expect to see in public. The offer sounds like it's for your comfort. You're the one who feels awkward if you don't go along. I shook my head and said I'd just meet her when she got here. His mouth tightened slightly. Not much, but enough to notice. The polite tone slipped just enough for him to say, "Well, it's right here," with more of a point to it this time, like I was dragging my feet for no reason. A part of me felt that flush of wanting to end the conversation without making it any more uncomfortable. But the other part of me was counting how many seconds had passed since I'd texted Stephanie. I repeated myself, said I'd wait here. He didn't argue directly, but he held my eyes for a few seconds longer before he nodded once and turned back toward the street. I watched him walk around the corner but didn't follow. I stayed where I was, scrolling through my phone, waiting for a message back. Almost 10 minutes later, when I still hadn't heard from her, I decided to head back toward the apartment I was renting for the summer. The sidewalks were still bright, edges of awnings throwing thin strips of shade that didn't really help. About halfway back, I heard the sound of a slow car engine behind me. When I glanced over my shoulder, a dark sedan was following down the street with its headlights off. The front windows were tinted just enough that I couldn't tell if it was him for sure, but the shape was close enough. The thing about a car with no lights in late daylight is that it doesn't stand out for the first couple of glances. If you're not expecting it, you'll barely notice. But once you know to look, the pattern jumps. Same speed as you, same distance. It's deliberate, without breaking a law that anyone else would notice. When I reached a side entrance to one of the academic buildings, I hesitated. The heavy double doors were mostly glass, making the lobby easy to see. Inside was empty, just the faint blue glow from a vending machine by the far wall. I stepped closer, like I might duck in, just long enough to see if the sedan would react. That's when my phone buzzed. I pulled it out without thinking, expecting it to be from a classmate or group chat. Instead, there was a single message from a number I didn't recognize. No name, no thread above it, just the words, short and clipped. Saw you today. My stomach dropped in a way that felt more physical than mental. I didn't move for a couple of seconds. The glow from the phone screen lit my hand and the front of my shirt. I swiped to the home screen just to keep the message from staring back at me, but my eyes still had the text burned into them. I glanced up toward the street. The sedan hadn't moved closer, but it was still angled toward the path, engine still turning. It's one thing to suspect someone's watching from across a distance. It's another to have them put it in writing. My thumb hovered over the reply option, then slid to screenshot instead. The click of the capture was louder in my head than it actually was. Screenshot, then another one of the number itself. My pulse felt higher now. Messages like that don't happen by accident. The number had to come from somewhere. If it was really the same man from earlier, posing as Stephanie's father, then he'd either had it planned already or found out who I was after I left. Both options meant more time spent on me than I wanted to think about. I took a half step toward the door, not sure if going inside would help. A building this late at night might be empty enough to trap me instead. The warmth in the air was pressing now, like it wanted to push me to move, just to get somewhere cooler. I slid the phone into my back pocket and kept walking, circling between the pools of light, never quite giving my full back to the street until I had to. Behind me, the rumble of the engine faded for a few seconds and then picked up again. I didn't look. I didn't need to. It stayed just far enough away to make it feel like coincidence if anyone else were around to witness. But in the second it took to round another corner, my phone buzzed again. This time, there were more words, enough that I had to slow down to read them, without tripping on the uneven sidewalk. The tone shifted. It wasn't a vague hint anymore. It was clear, direct, and without any pretense of friendliness. Cars look different when you know who might be inside them. I was walking across the east side of campus after dark, taking one of those narrow paved walkways, lined with old brick buildings on one side, and a stretch of dense trees on the other. The overhead lamps along the path gave off soft, yellow circles of light that didn't quite meet each other, leaving patches of shadow between. My sandals stuck slightly to the warm pavement with each step. Even though the sun had been down for 2 hours, the summer air still clung to everything, thick enough to feel heavy in your lungs. Halfway down the block, I slowed without meaning to. You pick up on pacing. It's one of the first things your body notices before your head catches up. And something in the air behind me felt matched to mine. There weren't many people out this time of night. Most of the noise came from the faint hum of window units and the occasional muffled laugh from an open dorm window. I glanced back once in the middle of one of those shadow patches. Around the corner of the building at the far end of the walkway, I caught the low-beam spill from an idling car. Not bright headlights, more like the subtle reflection off a chrome bumper catching a bit of lamplight. Then I noticed the faint movement of exhaust rising. The car wasn't pulled into a spot. It was angled slightly in the corner, right where the walkway opened into the street. Engine on, lights off. Even at a distance, I recognized the shape. Same four-door sedan from earlier that day. Same low roofline. Same dark paint that made the outline bleed into the shadow. I let out a breath through my nose and kept walking, trying not to stiffen my shoulders. Vehicles are quiet enough at idle that you don't really hear them unless you're listening. But once you notice, it anchors itself in the back of your head. The distance between you and the car starts to take on weight. There's a reason people use cars for this kind of thing. The driver can keep a clear view of you while staying just far enough back to not have to explain themselves. They can move with you or stop entirely. It's control without direct contact. If you're alone on foot, every turn you take, every well-lit spot you decide to cross, it's all visible to them. The walkway bent slightly as it passed under the largest trees in the row. The lamplight broke up into scattered shapes on the ground, flickering a little with the breeze. My shirt was sticking to the center of my back by then. I could hear my own steps clearer, because the cicadas had grown quiet for a moment. I didn't want to look again, but I kept imagining the sedan creeping forward, stopping just before the next pool of light. I crossed at the next intersection even though I hadn't planned to, just to see what the sedan would do. It slowed for a second, then kept going straight. When I turned the corner and glanced again, it had looped around the block and was coming toward me from the side street. My chest tightened. I didn't wait for it to catch up. I stepped off the curb and cut through the lot of a grocery store I happened to be next to, weaving between the cars until I could take another side exit that led toward a busier road. The whole walk back I kept thinking about timing. Whether he'd been there before I arrived, whether I'd been picked out specifically, whether Stephanie was even a real person or just a profile put together to make that sidewalk meeting happen. The more I replayed it, the less it felt like any of it was accidental. There was no reason for him to be that insistent if it was harmless, and no reason for him to be in that sedan later, unless he wanted me to know he could follow if he wanted to. By the time I locked the apartment door behind me, the heat outside felt like it was still in my hair and clothes. My phone buzzed a few minutes later, but it wasn't from Stephanie. No apology. No explanation for why only the man had shown up. The match on the app had gone gray. The whole conversation gone with it. Sex hooks. Some people approach you fast, cutting right into your personal space. Others keep it measured, using roles and situations you're used to seeing in safe contexts. Parents, family members, co-workers. It's hardwired to lower your guard when you think there's an extra layer of accountability. That's what he had leaned on, making me feel like the strange part was my reaction, not his offer. I didn't see him for the rest of the day, but that feeling didn't leave. Once you have the image of someone circling in a car just out of range, you start looking for it again, whether you want to or not. Every intersection I passed that night I checked. Every street lamp I walked under I listened for the shift in engine noise behind me. It should have ended there, just a strange encounter on a hot afternoon. Another thing to be cautious about. But later that same night, it came back around. Not in the exact same way. This time it wasn't the casual voice of someone claiming a connection. It was the quiet hum of an engine sitting still, waiting at the edge of where the walkway dipped under shadow. And this time, the headlights stayed off too. When I reached a side entrance to one of the academic buildings, I hesitated. The heavy double doors were mostly glass, making the lobby easy to see. Inside was empty, just the faint blue glow from a vending machine by the far wall. I stepped closer, like I might duck in, just long enough to see if the sedan would react. That's when my phone buzzed. I pulled it out without thinking, expecting it to be from a classmate or group chat. Instead, there was a single message from a number I didn't recognize. No name, no thread above it, just the words, short and clipped. Saw you today. My stomach dropped in a way that felt more physical than mental. I didn't move for a couple of seconds. The glow from the phone screen lit my hand and the front of my shirt. I swiped to the home screen just to keep the message from staring back at me, but my eyes still had the text burned into them. I glanced up toward the street. The sedan hadn't moved closer, but it was still angled toward the path, engine still turning. It's one thing to suspect someone's watching from across a distance. It's another to have them put it in writing. My thumb hovered over the reply option, then slid to screenshot instead. The click of the capture was louder in my head than it actually was. Screenshot, then another one of the number itself. My pulse felt higher now. Messages like that don't happen by accident. The number had to come from somewhere. If it was really the same man from earlier, posing as Stephanie's father, then he'd either had it planned already or found out who I was after I left. Both options meant more time spent on me than I wanted to think about. I took a half step toward the door, not sure if going inside would help. A building this late at night might be empty enough to trap me instead. The warmth in the air was pressing now, like it wanted to push me to move, just to get somewhere cooler. I slid the phone into my back pocket and kept walking, circling between the pools of light, never quite giving my full back to the street until I had to. Behind me, the rumble of the engine faded for a few seconds and then picked up again. I didn't look. I didn't need to. It stayed just far enough away to make it feel like coincidence if anyone else were around to witness. But in the second it took to round another corner, my phone buzzed again. This time, there were more words, enough that I had to slow down to read them, without tripping on the uneven sidewalk. The tone shifted. It wasn't a vague hint anymore. It was clear, direct, and without any pretense of friendliness. I stopped under one of the brighter lamps and took another set of screenshots. Swiping to the camera, I took one quick picture over my shoulder, catching the gap between two buildings and the street beyond where the sedan had been. It didn't feel like enough. Nothing about holding a phone in your hand changes the fact that a car can cross the gap between you in seconds. My mouth was dry. Every open space between a building entrance and a crosswalk felt like a stretch too wide. Somewhere behind me, the same low rumble shifted as the sedan rolled forward again. I pressed against the side of a brick wall as two other students walked past in the opposite direction. I didn't say anything, but being near other people in that moment let my shoulders drop a fraction. Threats over text are harder to dismiss than glances or trailing footsteps. They're also harder for the person sending them to explain away later, which was the one sliver of comfort I clung to. A screenshot turned something into a piece of evidence. Even if nothing happened that night, even if they drove off right now, the words would stay the same. I started walking again, angling toward one of the bigger dorm clusters where I knew there'd be movement even at this hour. The sedan idled longer at the last corner I had to turn before the quad opened up in front of me. I kept my steps even, phone in my hand now instead of my pocket. The second I was in sight of the lit windows and the small group sitting out on the grass, I let myself breathe through my mouth. The heat still stuck to me, the air still dense, but my ribs felt less tight. One of the dorm doors clanged shut behind someone coming out. Normal sound. Everyday sound. But the message on my phone didn't belong in a normal day. The last buzz on my phone came right as I reached the front steps. The number was still unsaved, the notification bold and insistent. I didn't open it before I stepped inside and let the door close behind me. Instead, I took the screenshot from the lock screen, holding the phone steady so my thumb didn't shake too much. I already knew that if the earlier message had been sharp, this one would cut even closer. Reading exactly how someone wants to hurt you changes the air in the room. I was standing just inside the dorm door, the hum of the lobby vending machine filling the space behind me, when my phone lit up again. The lock screen showed the notification banner in clean black text on a gray background. No filler words, no lead-in, just, "You're a little piece of... You're lucky you got away. I would have strangled your ugly ass." Seeing it there, with my thumb hovering but not touching, felt different than hearing a threat out loud. Out loud, you can dampen the tone or mishear a word. Written, it sits there like it's carved in place. I unlocked the phone slowly, like part of me expected the words to shift into something else. They didn't. The message sat in its own bubble. No other texts before it, no number saved at the top. My eyes went to the punctuation first. Not frantic, no typos, nothing that looked like the kind of hurried drunk or angry key smash you'd hope for from someone just lashing out in the moment. Every space, every letter was where it was meant to be, controlled rage. It's harder to tell yourself it's meaningless when the person sending it took the time to be clear. My hands flexed without me thinking about it. I wanted to toss the phone into my bag and slam the locker room door, but instead I opened the screenshot tool. Capturing it took 2 tries because the first time my thumb grazed the wrong corner and the camera app came up instead. I swallowed and tried again, this time pressing both buttons until I heard the faint click. A still image is easy to send, easy to store. Even with the screen dark, my brain kept replaying the words in the voice I imagined they'd use if they'd said it in person. There's a reason written threats carry weight legally. When police deal with stalking or harassment reports, texts and direct messages become tangible evidence in a way memory of a conversation can't. You can't argue about tone or claim misunderstanding the same way when the exact sentence is sitting in plain view. No matter how they meant it, they still made the choice to write it down, to put it in a form that can't be taken back. I'd read about that before, how investigators will flag those moments as moving from implication to explicit. This wasn't vague now. They mapped out what they wanted to do. I went to my contacts page, hit block caller, and watched the confirmation pop up. My thumb pressed confirm before I even thought about it, but the tension didn't ease. Blocking a number doesn't undo the fact that they got it in the first place. Doesn't stop them from trying again with a different one. Still, it was what I could do in that exact minute. I closed the messaging app altogether and set the phone face down on the small desk beside the lobby couch. My fingers itched to pick it back up, to check for any sound or buzz, but I didn't. I leaned back against the couch's armrest, the synthetic fabric rough against my shoulder. I kept flexing my hands. Even in the building with the door locked between me and outside, I didn't feel sealed off from him. I thought about walking to the campus police office right away, but the night air past the glass doors felt like too much of a space to cross. I settled for pulling up my photo roll again. One screenshot of the first vague message, another of the one parked under the streetlight, and now this. It didn't feel like proof yet. It felt like a series of points someone else would have to connect. I told myself out loud, "You're taking this to the police." Just putting it into sound anchored it a little. Saying it made it less of a maybe and more like a step, waiting in line. Because you could call the words anything, anger, bluff, venting, but stripped down to their bare meaning, they were about control through fear. It wasn't about sending an apology after or revising it. It was about planning it in my head so that every time I checked my phone, I'd imagine the person behind it. It worked, too. My mouth was dry again, tongue sticking to the roof while I sat there. I unblocked the number long enough to grab every scrap of info the phone would show me. Area code, time sent, message length, and then blocked it again. The empty gray placeholder for contact name at the top was a reminder that I couldn't connect it to anything solid yet. He wanted me to think about it, and I was. My brain ran over the rest of that day like a slow tape, rewinding to see if there'd been other signals I'd brushed past. People don't start with the clearest form of themselves. They layer it in. A passing look in the street, a carefully chosen word, the slow drawl of an offer. By the time you're staring at the direct statement, the foundation's already been tested. That's where the fear locks in. It's about proving they can get right next to you, speak like it's nothing, and then leave you with the threat when they go quiet. I picked up the phone again and set a reminder in my calendar for the morning. The note just said, "Bring screenshots." I didn't need to attach explanation. The images spoke fine without it. Whoever saw them next, I wanted them to have that same pause I'd had. Reading it cold, without me in front of them, not able to look away from the plain sentence. Another student came down the stairs, toward the vending machine, and I took it as my signal to move. I stood, slid the phone into my pocket, and walked toward the elevators without meeting their eyes. Leaving the lobby, the air in the hallway felt cooler, less dense, but my skin still crawled with the afterimage of the message text. I didn't open my window when I got back to my room. I left the curtain pulled tight, the fan on low, Lying on the bed, I could still see each word printed out in my head in that blocky font, each letter steady and unshaken. The clock by my bed clicked over to 12. My reminder sat there in tomorrow's list, small and clean against the background. It didn't matter if he'd meant to frighten me, or if he thought it was just some grim joke. He'd chosen to write down exactly what he wanted to happen. That choice kept me awake longer than I wanted. Every time I shifted, the blanket edges clung at my legs like they'd been tightened. When I finally closed my eyes, the echo of the day shoved itself into the same corner of my mind where I'd stored the woman on the porch, the stranger in the grocery store, the still car under the trees. Not the same face, not the same voice, but the same kind of hold. A presence you didn't invite that still manages to get inside your space, making you rearrange how you move without touching you at all. It wasn't going to settle on its own. The screenshots, the reminder, the plan for where to go next, those were the only parts tonight that felt like they might matter later. In one sense, the message gave me the thing an officer would actually take seriously. In another, it stripped away the buffer of wondering. Now I knew what sat underneath all the pacing, all the steady distances and angles. I lay there listening to the building's pipes groan and the faint whir of the fan blades overhead. The language in that message was still trying to crowd out every other thought. But instead, I started counting the number of steps, from my bed to the door, then from my door to the elevator, then from the elevator to the street. Small, definite measures in a space I knew well. It was a way to remind myself how close I could get to being out in the open again, and how quickly I could pull back if I needed to. This was someone using words in the most direct way they could, staking out control without showing up in that moment. Different from standing across from me or pulling up at a sidewalk, but just as deliberate. And there was a different kind of trap waiting in my memory, one from an entirely different setting. A trap in a place I'd thought was mine alone for the night, where the air chilled your skin and the sound carried twice as far as it should in the dead of winter. Snowstorm insulation makes every indoor sound sharper. That night the wind outside was heavy with snow, dulling the usual hum of traffic and swallowing anything more than a few yards away. I was working the late shift as the janitor at the community college, making my way through the art building. Most nights I didn't mind the quiet. Classes were over by 6, and after that it was just me, my keys and the sound of my own shoes on the tile. But the cold had settled into the walls, and in buildings like that, you can hear every pipe adjust, every vent tick, as it pushes warm air against winter trying to creep in. The basement wasn't part of my usual route until Fridays, but with the snow piling against the loading dock out back, I figured I'd clean it then instead of waiting for next week. The stairwell dropped fast, no landings, just a straight shot down. The further I went, the more the air changed from dry and warm to something else. Cold enough that my breath came out in small clouds. The overhead light buzzed. Even with it on, the space felt dim, like the light could only spread so far before the cold swallowed it. The basement stretched in two directions. To the left was the storage for metalworking, rows of old stools stacked in uneven towers, tables with their legs unbolted and leaning against wall racks. To the right was where they kept large art installations and mannequin figures used in sculpture and fashion design. They were hidden under off-white cloths to keep dust off, each shape vaguely human and still. Some stood in lines, others leaned against the wall like they'd been pushed there and forgotten.
Every few minutes, the building shifted and gave a noise for it, pipes groaning up in the ceiling from hot water, fighting the cold in the lines. Somewhere a faint, regular hum from the vents overhead that didn't quite match the rhythm of my breathing. When you're the only one in the space, those sounds start to feel like things moving just at the edge of your hearing. You learn to sort them quick. Vent hum, fine. Metal creak from a stool leg in the next room, fine. Anything uneven or sudden, reason to stop and listen. I wheeled the mop bucket past the row of mannequins without thinking much about them at first. The cloth slipped down a little on one of them, revealing a pale hand with chipped paint where fingers had knocked into each other over the years. I pushed it back in place. Under the cloths, all of them were anchored to weighted stands. They shouldn't go anywhere on their own. But the way the overhead light cast their shadows onto the far wall made it easy to think you'd seen a head turn. That part of the basement wasn't huge, maybe the size of a small classroom, but the ceiling was high and sloped on one side where the vents ran. Sound carried strangely. My own footsteps would bounce back to me just after I'd heard them the first time. It's the kind of place that feels bigger than it is when you're alone. Isolation like that works in two ways. Makes you feel like you control the space because you know it so well, but also makes you realize how long it would take anyone else to get to you if something went wrong. You'd hear them first, sure, but you'd also hear them with no idea how close they actually were. After about 20 minutes, I went back toward the stairs to dump the dirty water. Passing the mannequins again, my eyes caught on one in the corner. The cloth draped over it wasn't hanging the same way it had earlier. It used to fall in a straight line just past the edge of the base. Now the front edge was shifted, pulled tighter against one side like it had been brushed or turned. I stopped with my hand still on the mop handle. The air in the basement felt even colder in that moment, the kind that works its way between the layers you're wearing. My first thought was that I'd just bumped it earlier without realizing, maybe when I was pushing the bucket past. I stepped back a little, angling my head to see if the cloth was just wrinkled differently. But from the way the base shadowed under it, something underneath had shifted. There's a split second in places like that, where your body makes a decision before your head gets there. Mine decided I wasn't walking past it again. Not close enough to find out. The open space between me and the stairs suddenly felt like a lot more ground than before. I started moving wide around the mannequins, sticking to the edge by the metal stools. That's when the fabric twitched, not from a draft cold, as it was. The air in the basement didn't move like that. It was a short, uneven push from underneath, just enough to shift the hanging edge and then let it fall back. I froze mid-step. I didn't hear breathing, nothing so obvious, but the cloth settled in the same slow way you see when someone lets go of it. If I'd been halfway past it when that happened, I don't know if I'd have kept walking or bolted. But with the space still between us, I kept my eyes on it and edged back until there was a clear path to the stairs. The back of the mop bucket bumped into a stool leg, and the light ringed over it in a quick flash. I glanced at the other mannequin still, covered still as before. Only the one in the corner looked touched. The vents above gave a low rattle just then, like they were going to kick more warm air into the room. I didn't wait. I spun the bucket in front of me and wheeled it fast toward the stairs, letting the mop handle rest against my forearm so my free hand could grip the railing the second I reached it. Asterisk at the top. The door to the main level swung, heavier than I remembered, the hinge catching slightly from the cold. The air upstairs was warmer, and I could hear the low hum of the soda machine from the student lounge. Normal noise, easy noise. I kept glancing toward the stairwell door behind me. Nothing came through, no sound of anyone following, but the image of that lopsided cloth stayed sharp in my mind. Along with the moment it shifted for no reason, I wanted to check up close. I told myself it could have been a trick of the light. Old fabric moves easy if there's a temperature change, even from a vent. But I knew the way that twitch had looked. Not a slow pull from heat or air pressure, more like a single, small motion, something brushing near the inside. Enough to tell me that avoiding it had been the better call. I didn't step down there again for the rest of the shift. The storm outside kept pressing against the doors, snow stacking along the bottom edges of the glass. Streetlights caught the flakes and made them blur into long streaks. In the quiet, upstairs halls, I could still feel that basement cold in my hands. Sometimes it follows you like that once it's in your head. The physical part sticks around longer than it should. By the time I finished my rounds on the main level, the building felt settled again. No rattles from the vents, no pops in the pipes. But the fact that I'd noticed the change, that small detail out of place, was what sat just under the surface. Because when you work in a place long enough, you remember how each corner's supposed to look. You walk past the same shapes every night, hear the same background noises. You spot what's off, even if you wish you could explain it away. Back in the supply room, I hung the mop on its hook and let the bucket sit under the drain. The thought of the cloth in the corner pulled my focus enough that I didn't hear the first sound right above me. It came as a soft, metallic thump, barely there under the hum of the vending machines and the snow-muted quiet. Then another, closer, like pressure shifting on something thin and hollow, pushing just enough to make it give. I stood still, head tilted toward the ceiling, waiting to figure out if it was just the building settling under the cold, or if something was moving through the spaces above my head. Asterisk, the metal above your head is supposed to be empty air duct. I stood in the supply room, listening after that first dull thump. It didn't sound like something dropped, it was more of a shift, like weight pressing against sheet metal and letting go. Then came another, closer this time. The vents here ran in long rectangular stretches just under the basement ceiling, boxed in with thin aluminum panels. They groaned a little in the winter whenever the hot air came through, but they weren't groaning now. They were reacting to something moving. I tilted my head up and stared at one of the wider ducts that cut directly across the room. The surface wasn't smooth anymore. Under the yellow light, you could see shallow indents push outward, and then ease back, spaced a few feet apart, in the rhythm of crawling. The sound was faint, but the closed space dragged the echo around the corners, so it felt like it could be above you, or 2 rooms away. A piece of frost dropped from one of the seams, where 2 sections met and landed just in front of the mop bucket. It broke apart on the tile in a little puff of white that made my jaw clench. Warm air had been running earlier. There was no reason for frost unless something cold from outside was coming through, or someone had opened a vent panel from the roof or outside wall. The chatter of the vending machine in the hall sounded far away now, like I'd stepped into a separate pocket of air. I knew most of the vent layout from years working here. The bigger ducts fed from the furnace room into each basement storage space, then thinned into smaller lines that threaded the ceiling on the main floors. You could fit a person in the wide sections if you really wanted to. I'd read before comes up in training that break-ins sometimes happen through vents or ceiling cavities in older buildings because no one thinks to reinforce them. A ceiling tile, a loose panel, and you can move between rooms without touching the doors. Maintenance uses them for work. Someone else could use them for staying unseen until they pop out where they want. The thump came again, softer than a dragging sound like the edge of fabric or a sleeve rubbing along metal. I stepped back until my shoulders brushed the wall. The duct above me curved toward the main hallway. That meant whoever, or whatever, was in there could be heading toward the stairs up. My eyes kept darting to the lip of the duct just over the doorway, imagining it sliding open while I was still standing under it. I had 2 ways out: the basement stairwell up to the main level, or the wide bay door to the back dock. The dock was buried in snow from hours of drift, and it would drop me outside into a wind that had already piled it chest high against the dumpsters. That wasn't an option if there was any chance someone was waiting. Staying down here was worse. I kept my eyes on the duct and edged toward the basement stairs, forcing myself not to rush and make more noise than I had to. Another light shake traveled along the panel near the ceiling corner, far enough away that I couldn't see it fully. A screw squealed, short and sharp, like it had been shifted in place. I didn't wait for the next sound. The stairwell was narrow, the kind that makes your back tense waiting for a hand to grab your foot from the bottom step. I took them 2 at a time, one hand on the rail, trying to keep my breathing low. Air warmed a little with every step, but the feeling that something could be matching my pace above the ceiling grid stuck with me. That's the thing about knowing someone's moving in a space above you. You don't know which point they can drop down from until they do it. They can track your route without being on the same floor. At the top, my key slipped once in the lock before the door gave. The latch made a sound that felt too loud in the empty hall. I stepped through fast and pulled the door shut. My ears were doing that thing where they hunt for the absence of noise, trying to measure if anything's trailing you. The duct in here ran down the hallway on my left, narrower, but still big enough to carry sound. I started toward the front of the building instead of my normal loop back to the supply closet. The hall felt longer than usual. Every overhead light made a faint electric tick, and between those ticks was the sound of my shoes on the tile. I could feel that tightness behind my ears I get when I know my body's locked on to tracking something, even if I can't place it yet. Halfway down the hall, I heard weight shift above the ceiling again. Not a thud this time, a tiny flex of metal, then the faint vibration of something moving toward my direction. My mouth was dry, the kind of dry where swallowing is louder than your steps. I didn't look up through the grid because I didn't want that image in my head later, but I could see the angled shadows on the ceiling panels change in rhythm with the sound. I cut right at the first intersecting hallway and picked up my pace. The main entrance was already locked for the night, but the side exit by the offices opened with my key. The snow on that side was only ankle deep. I stepped out just enough to confirm I could get clear if I needed to, then stopped. Out here, it was just wind and streetlight glare on drifts. No movement. Inside, the building seemed to hold its breath. I stood in the shadow by the door, listening to the vents settle. They didn't settle. Another tiny shake, like someone testing where the duct joined the wall. That confirmed it for me. It hadn't been the cold or an animal. Animals didn't stop and start like they were checking their sight lines. I didn't go back for my things. In the supply closet, I left the key in the exit door, stepped outside fully, and let it swing shut behind me. The wind hit my face harder now, but the space out here felt better than the air inside. Snow soaked into the tops of my shoes as I crossed to the lot. Even as I reached my car, I kept glancing back at the lit windows of the hall, half expecting to see a shift in the blinds or a shadow move in a place no one should be at this hour. I didn't wait to find out. The engine started rough in the cold. I let it idle only long enough to clear the windshield before pulling out. My chest didn't unclench until I was on the road, the building dropping away in the rear view. It wasn't just the sound in the vents, it was the stops between movements. The pauses that felt like someone listening for me as much as I was listening for them. I've heard plenty of building noises in winter, every groan and click they make when the heat runs. Those pauses weren't part of it. Driving home, the wiper blades thumped slow against the glass. I kept picturing where the vents connected, which rooms they crossed, how easy it would be to map someone's route from one end of the building to the other without a single door opening. That's the thing about access points, you think they belong to the building until someone else decides they belong to them. By the time the turn for my street came up, I'd already decided I wasn't going back there until I told someone. Not part of it, not just a passing mention, but the full thing. If the movement was deliberate, and I'd bet it was, it meant there was a way into that building no one was watching. And if they were already using it, then last night wouldn't be the only time. ***, some stories are easier to keep to yourself. I was still turning over what happened in the vents when I pulled into the lot the next morning. Snow piled thick along the edges where the plow hadn't reached. My shoes sank into the slush by the curb, and the cold air bit at my ears in short, sharp bursts. The whole sky still carried that flat white look it gets when the storm isn't finished yet. I hadn't expected to see anyone waiting. But there was Tom leaning against the frame of the staff entrance, coffee steam curling up past his face. He kept his other hand in his pocket, nodding when I got closer. "You're here early," he said, his voice carried low in the cold. That dull way sound reacts when it's trapped under heavy weather. I shrugged, not sure how to start, and fished my key from my coat. I could have told him right then, in one breath, about the sound of weight crawling overhead and the metal flexing like there was something alive in it. I could have described the frost falling onto the tiles, the shifting pause like someone was stopping to listen for me. Instead, I said, there was a noise last night, downstairs. I left it there, vague enough that it could be explained away as the heating system or a loose panel somewhere in the storage rooms. He raised his eyebrows, but didn't press right away. Maybe he knew that if you corner someone on the details, you get less than if you let them spill on their own. I kept talking, but only enough to log it as something worth checking. Could have been the pipes. It was cold enough for them to pop, I added, trying to make my voice match the casual tone. The real part swelled in my throat for a second, the urge to say what I'd actually seen, but my mind ran through the usual list of how telling it could go. The look that says you've stretched an ordinary sound into a story. The polite nod and a line about old buildings making weird noises, or worse, someone deciding to investigate. Little enough that whoever was inside those vents would never be found, leaving me as the one who overreacted. People keep back details for all kinds of reasons. Sometimes you don't want to see disbelief on the other person's face, because that makes the whole thing feel sharper in your own head, like maybe you are the only one who felt what you felt. Other times you know that saying it out loud shifts it from something you can push aside into something sitting in the open, waiting for a follow-up you're not ready for. And sometimes it's because once the detail's out, you can't pull it back. You've put the image in someone else's mind, and if they don't treat it seriously, it feels like you handed them your fear for nothing. Tom didn't ask what kind of noise, just said, "I'll check it out later," between sips of coffee. That was it. No hurry in his body language, no twitch of surprise. Just the calm surface of someone who knows the building enough to believe there's a simple fix somewhere. Asterisk, asterisk, I nodded like that was good enough. The truth was, watching him stand in the doorway, it was hard to picture him moving quick enough into that basement if there really had been someone down there. Not out of age or anything, just because his whole way of working moved at a slower gear. He could look at a room for minutes before starting a repair. That kind of time wasn't going to help if the problem was mobile. We stepped inside, the warm air from the vents upstairs, flushing my skin back from the cold. My insides still had that thick, unsettled knot from last night. I told myself again it was better to leave it half-said, at least until I figured out whether anyone else had been around. If maintenance found a loose panel or signs of an animal nest, it would be over before it turned into something bigger. If they didn't, it was still mine to track, not something passed on and left in someone else's file. Asterisk. I signed in at the staff desk and hung my coat. The sound of the zipper sticking partway down was the loudest detail in the room for a good 10 seconds. Tom moved off toward the main hall, keys jangling once against his belt before they went quiet again. The urge to call after him, to tack on one more sentence, it sounded like someone crawling above me, was right there. But I pushed it down. Part of me wanted not to say it, because the basement was his territory. The moment I gave him that image, it'd move into his set of responsibilities. And if he didn't believe it, or didn't act on it, I'd have to deal with that drop. It's easier sometimes to keep that control in your own hands, even if it means carrying more of the weight yourself. The smell of the building was the same as always, waxed from the floor polish sitting over the faint dust of old books from the adjacent wing, the kind of familiarity that makes you think you'd notice any shift right away. Last night had proved otherwise. Things can move in those same halls without leaving behind marks you can point to. I busied myself with the supply. Check. Paper towels, cleaning solution, the slow count of boxes, until it matched last week's note. Every few minutes my mind offered up the image of the duct shifting. Did whoever was in there know I'd spotted it? Had they been close enough to hear the mop bucket rattle, the stool scrape? Small fragments swam up quick and left me standing, with my hand on a box I'd already counted twice. Some rooms are easier to leave behind than others. The basement felt heavier than any of the upstairs spaces, but putting it into Tom's hands wasn't going to make me avoid it entirely. It might even drag him into doing a walkthrough with me later, and that could make me step closer to spots I'd deliberately gone around out by mid-morning. The outside light had gone, that pale color that snow can bring even without sun. Through the narrow office windows, you could see flakes still drifting down. Slower now, but steady enough to blur the outlines of parked cars. I kept glancing at the paths between buildings, watching for any movement out of place. Habit, leftover hypervigilance from other nights, in other settings. When lunch came, I cut out early, waving toward Tom without slowing down. My boots made that soft creak on the rubber mat as I stepped outside again. Breath fogged in front of me, quick to disappear with each exhale. The lot had patches of ice under a thin skin of snow, and the wind pushed against my jacket hard enough to make the fabric snap. The building door clicked shut behind me. On the walk to my car, I thought about how light the air felt out here, compared to downstairs. No ducts to carry sound over my head. No corners where the light failed to touch. Just the open, even if it was cold enough to sting the inside of my nose. Snow underfoot has this way of reminding you you're leaving a trail. Every step pressed into the layer for anyone to follow. Still, in that moment, it felt safer than going back in for more answers. I slid into the driver's seat, letting the heat start up slow. My rear view showed the building shrinking as I pulled away, the roof lying dull against the white-gray sky. I knew I hadn't shaken what I'd seen. It was still turning somewhere in the back of my head, but I'd chosen to carry it myself for now. Half the truth was all I'd given, and that was enough to get me out the door without staying for explanations I wasn't ready to hear. The roads leading home were dusted with fresh powder, tire tracks already starting to fill. Houses sat muted, under the weather, windows glowing faint in the early afternoon light. That in-between time when it's neither day nor night, yet feels like where a lot of these moments live, carried forward, without a loud ending. Just settling into the pattern of other things you notice and can't quite file away. Somewhere behind each one is the choice of what to say out loud and what to keep back, and how both can change the way you move after. Driving past the last row of houses before my street, I thought about how each of these nights, whether it was someone on a porch, watching across a store aisle, following in a car, or shifting above ceiling panels, had left the same residue. Different seasons, different weather, but connected by that single point when you realize you're not the only one in your space, and you don't control who comes in or how long they stay. Asterisk, winter storms, summer heat, midnight rain, it didn't matter. The feeling was always the same. Once someone decides they belong in your space, you start to move differently inside it. The rooms don't shrink, but they feel like they have edges you can't see anymore. Locks become something you check twice, not because they're broken, but because now you know they can be tested. And doors only work when no one pushes them. I still catch myself wondering, in grocery lines or passing parked cars, how many times I've been watched without knowing. How many times anyone has, without noticing.